Sometimes the people we judge the harshest carry the heaviest secrets. Sometimes the ones we dismiss as failures are protecting treasures we could never imagine. In Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, they called Tsela the crazy Apache woman. Her old canvas tent sat on the edge of town where nobody wanted to live. For 20 years, folks rode past and shouted cruel words. "You wasted everything!" They'd yell, laughing as they headed to the mines. They saw a broken-down Indian woman who had nothing left. But Tsela never answered back. She just watched them quietly from her tent, raising her granddaughter Naliné with gentle hands and old stories. When Tsela died, everyone expected her tent to disappear. Instead, young Naliné found something hidden beneath the floor that would shock the entire town. What could an old Apache woman have been hiding all those years that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in 1885 was a land where fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a shovel, where hope and desperation walked hand in hand down dusty streets that baked under an unforgiving sun. Copper Creek had been one of those boom towns that sprouted like desert wildflowers after a rare rain, fed by rumors of silver veins and copper deposits that ran deeper than a man's dreams. The town stretched along a narrow valley between rust-colored mesas, its main street a ribbon of packed earth, flanked by wooden buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. The Silver Dollar Saloon anchored one end of the street, its batwing doors constantly swinging as miners sought refuge from the heat and their troubles. At the other end stood the first bank of Copper Creek, a surprisingly sturdy brick building that Samuel Whitmore had insisted on constructing when the town was flush with mining money. Between these bookends of vice and virtue lay Morrison's General Store, the post office, a modest church that saw more funerals than weddings, and Sheriff Tom Morrison's office with its single jail cell that reeked of regret and cheap whiskey. But it was at the very edge of town, where the last building gave way to open desert, that Tsela had made her home. Her canvas tent, patched and repatched over the years, sat like a weathered sentinel overlooking the road that led to the mines. The structure itself told a story of persistence, layers of different fabrics sewn together with careful stitches, corners reinforced with leather salvaged from old boots, and guy ropes that had been replaced so many times they resembled a spider's web against the desert sky. Inside, the tent was a study in efficient simplicity. A small, wood-burning stove occupied the center, its chimney pipe extending through a carefully sealed hole in the canvas roof. Tsela had arranged the living space with the precision of someone who understood that every inch mattered. Her sleeping area was marked by a collection of beautiful woven blankets, their patterns speaking of Apache traditions that most white folks in Copper Creek neither understood nor cared to learn about. Along one wall, wooden crates served as both storage and seating, each one containing the carefully organized necessities of a life lived on the margins. Naliné's corner of the tent reflected the unique position she occupied between two worlds. A few dresses hung from a rope strung between tent poles, simple cotton garments that could pass for acceptable in town, alongside traditional Apache clothing that her grandmother insisted she learn to make and wear. Books, a rarity in their circumstances, were wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in a metal box that Tsela had acquired through means she never fully explained. These volumes, written in both English and Spanish, had been Naliné's windows into worlds beyond the desert, though she was careful never to be seen reading them where townspeople might notice. Tsela herself was a woman who defied easy categorization. At 63, her face carried the deep lines that came from squinting into desert sun and bearing sorrows that would have broken lesser souls. Her hands, gnarled from years of work that ranged from washing clothes for miners to tending sick horses, moved with surprising grace when she worked on her traditional crafts or prepared the medicinal teas that even some white women quietly sought out when their own remedies failed. but it was her eyes that told the real story. Dark as obsidian and just as sharp, they missed nothing that happened in Copper Creek. From her tent, positioned strategically on the slight rise at town's edge, Tsela could observe the comings and goings of every soul in the settlement. She knew which miners were doing well by the straightness of their backs when they rode to work, and which ones were struggling by the slump of their shoulders when they returned. She knew when Dutch Henley was planning something underhanded by the way he paced in front of his saloon, and when Sheriff Morrison was drinking more than he should by the extra care he took mounting his horse. The beaded medicine pouch that never left Tsela's side had belonged to her mother, and her mother's mother before that. It contained herbs for healing, small stones that held special meaning, and other items that represented the bridge between the world she had been born into and the one she now navigated with careful steps. The pouch itself was a work of art, tiny glass beads in patterns of blue and white that seemed to shift and flow like water when the light caught them just right. But more than its beauty, the pouch represented survival. It held the knowledge that had kept her and Naliné alive when others would have perished. Naliné, now 17, possessed a rare combination of her grandmother's observational skills and a quick mind that absorbed everything, from Apache traditions to the rudiments of reading and mathematics that Tsela had somehow managed to teach her. Unlike many of the young women in Copper Creek, who seemed destined for lives of washing, cooking, and bearing children for men who might or might not survive the dangers of mining, Naliné carried herself with a quiet confidence that made even the town's rougher elements treat her with a grudging respect. The relationship between grandmother and granddaughter was built on more than blood ties. It was a partnership forged by necessity and strengthened by genuine affection. Every evening, as the desert cooled and the sounds of the town settled into the familiar rhythm of men seeking comfort in drink and cards, Tsela would share the stories that connected Naliné to her heritage. These weren't just tales of ancient times, but practical lessons disguised as entertainment. "Watch the way a man holds his money when he thinks no one is looking," Tsela would say, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "That tells you more about his character than 100 Sunday sermons." Or she might point toward the mountains and explain how certain rock formations revealed the presence of valuable minerals, knowledge that she claimed came from her father, who had guided white prospectors in the days before the territory became too dangerous for such cooperation. The townspeople of Copper Creek had their own stories about Tsela, most of them wrong and all of them dismissive. They said she had been abandoned by her Apache husband when she proved barren, not knowing that Naliné was actually her daughter's child, a daughter who had died in the influenza outbreak of 1868, leaving behind a baby that Tsela had claimed as her own to protect. They whispered that she survived on charity and the few coins she earned from occasional work, not suspecting that her careful observation of their affairs had yielded far more valuable compensation. Dutch Henley, who owned the Silver Dollar Saloon and most of the profitable businesses that surrounded it, was particularly vocal in his contempt for Tsela's presence. A large man with the kind of belly that spoke of prosperity and the ruddy complexion that revealed his fondness for his own merchandise. Dutch had arrived in Copper Creek during the early boom years, with enough capital to establish himself as the town's most influential citizen. His saloon was more than a drinking establishment. It was where business deals were made, where information was traded, and where Dutch kept his finger on the pulse of everything that mattered in their corner of the territory. That squaw's tent is the first thing decent folks see when they come to our town. Dutch would complain to anyone who would listen. "Makes us look like we can't keep order, having her camping there like some kind of beggar." He had made several attempts over the years to have Tsela moved along, but somehow she always managed to produce just enough documentation to prove her right to occupy the small patch of land where her tent stood. Sheriff Tom Morrison, a man whose badge carried more authority than his character could support, found Tsela to be a convenient scapegoat for the town's occasional problems. when supplies went missing or when someone reported seeing suspicious activity near the mines. Morrison would make a show of questioning Tsela, knowing that the townspeople expected him to harass the most obvious outsider. What Morrison didn't realize was that Tsela's careful attention to detail meant she often knew more about actual criminal activity than he did, though she was far too wise to share such information with a man who couldn't be trusted to keep it confidential. Samuel Whitmore, the banker, took a different approach to the Indian problem. A thin, precise man who wore spectacles and kept meticulous records, Whitmore preferred to pretend that Tsela simply didn't exist. In his view, acknowledging her presence would be tantamount to accepting that Copper Creek was the kind of rough frontier settlement that attracted undesirable elements. Whitmore saw himself as a civilizing influence, and Tsela's tent was a constant reminder that civilization in the Arizona Territory was still a work in progress. The daily rhythm of life in Copper Creek followed patterns that had been established by necessity and reinforced by habit. Before dawn, the miners would emerge from their boarding houses and small cabins, their faces already set in the grim expressions of men heading underground to wrestle with rock and darkness. They would pass Tsela's tent on their way to the diggings, and many couldn't resist the opportunity to share their opinions about her presence. "Morning. Grandmother," they would call out, their voices heavy with sarcasm. "Still wasting away out there instead of going back to your people?" The cruelest among them would add variations on the theme that had become their standard greeting. "You wasted everything. Could have lived proper on the reservation. But here you are in the dirt like some old coyote." Tsela's response was always the same, silence that spoke of dignity they couldn't understand and strength they couldn't break. She would continue whatever task occupied her hands, whether it was mending clothes, grinding corn, or working on the beautiful beadwork that occasionally found buyers among the wives of the more successful miners. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. What the men of Copper Creek failed to notice was how carefully Tsela catalogued their behavior. She knew which miners were finding good ore by their improved mood and the way they walked with more confidence. She could tell when someone had made a significant strike by the subtle changes in their routine. An extra drink at Dutch's saloon, a new piece of equipment ordered from Morrison's store, or a letter sent to family back east through the post office. More importantly, she observed the patterns that revealed when men were desperate. Desperate men made poor decisions, and poor decisions often led to opportunities for someone patient enough to wait and smart enough to act when the time was right. Tsela had been waiting and watching for 20 years, and her patience was about to reveal its true value. The evenings in the tent were sacred time for Tsela and Naliné, when the harsh demands of survival in a hostile environment gave way to the gentler requirements of maintaining their connection to each other and to their heritage. As the desert cooled and the sounds of the town shifted from the bustle of commerce to the softer murmur of men seeking solace in drink and companionship, grandmother and granddaughter would sit together beside their small fire. These conversations served multiple purposes beyond the obvious comfort of family intimacy. Through stories that seemed like entertainment, Tsela was actually teaching Naliné everything she would need to survive in a world that offered few protections for Apache women. Disguised as tales of ancient heroes and traditional wisdom, these lessons covered everything from reading the character of strangers to understanding the true value of land and resources. Our people knew this desert long before the white men came. "Looking for shiny rocks," Tsela would say, her voice taking on the cadence of oral tradition. They knew which stones held metal and which mountains concealed treasures. But they also knew that the greatest treasure is knowledge, and the wisest course is sometimes to let others think you have nothing while you gather everything. As autumn settled over the territory in 1885, bringing the first relief from the summer's brutal heat, Tsela seemed to grow more reflective during these evening sessions. She spoke more frequently about the importance of patience, about the ways that seemingly powerless people could accumulate real influence, and about the responsibility that came with possessing knowledge that others lacked. "Promise me something." "Granddaughter," she said one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Promise me that when the time comes for you to decide what kind of woman you will be, you will remember that strength sometimes looks like weakness, and wisdom sometimes appears as foolishness to those who lack understanding." Naliné, who had learned to pay close attention to the subtle changes in her grandmother's tone and manner, sensed something different in these conversations. There was an urgency beneath Tsela's usual calm, a feeling that important information was being shared for reasons that weren't yet clear. But she was also her grandmother's student in the art of patience, so she listened carefully and trusted that understanding would come when the time was right. The medicine pouch that accompanied these evening conversations seemed to glow in the firelight, its beaded patterns shifting and dancing as if they contained their own life force. Sometimes Tsela would remove certain items from the pouch: a small piece of turquoise, a perfectly round stone, a piece of silver worked into the shape of a feather, and each item would prompt a story that connected their family's past to the uncertain future that lay ahead. What neither the townspeople nor Naliné fully understood was that these stories and the items in the medicine pouch were part of an elaborate system that Tsela had developed over 2 decades of careful observation and strategic thinking. Every story contained information that would prove crucial in the days to come, and every item in the pouch had been chosen for its significance to a plan that was both beautifully simple and remarkably sophisticated. The autumn of 1885 would prove to be the end of one chapter in the story of Tsela and Naliné, and the beginning of another that would transform not just their own lives, but the entire understanding of what it meant to survive and thrive in the harsh realities of the Arizona Territory. The tent that had sheltered them through so many seasons was about to reveal secrets that would change everything the people of Copper Creek thought they knew about the crazy Apache woman who had endured their contempt with such quiet dignity. The desert storm arrived without warning on a Tuesday night in early November, bringing with it the kind of wind that seemed to carry the voices of ancient spirits across the barren landscape. Naliné woke to the sound of the tent walls snapping like rifle shots as gusts of sand-laden air tested every rope and stake that held their shelter together. But it wasn't the storm that filled her with dread. It was the labored breathing coming from her grandmother's sleeping area. Tsela had been fighting a persistent cough for nearly a week, dismissing Naliné's concerns with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried her through 20 years of hardship in Copper Creek. "It's nothing that dessert sage and honey won't cure," she had insisted, brewing her traditional remedies with hands that shook slightly more than usual. But as the storm raged outside their fragile shelter, it became clear that this illness was beyond the reach of even Tsela's considerable knowledge of healing. "Grandmother," Naliné whispered, crawling across the tent floor to where Tsela lay, wrapped in the beautiful woven blanket that had been her most prized possession. The blanket itself was a masterpiece of Apache craftsmanship, its patterns telling stories of mountains and rivers, of eagles soaring and buffalo running free. The deep blues and rich reds seemed to pulse with life, even in the dim light of the storm-darkened tent. And the wool was so finely woven that it felt like touching clouds. Tsela's eyes opened at her granddaughter's voice, but they held a clarity that was somehow more alarming than confusion would have been. "The storm speaks tonight," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "It tells me that my time for watching and waiting is finished." "Don't say such things," Naliné replied, though her heart was already accepting what her mind refused to acknowledge. She had seen death before in Copper Creek. Miners crushed in cave-ins, men shot in disputes over claims, women worn down by the relentless demands of frontier life. But this was different. This was the person who had been her anchor in a world that offered few safe harbors for people like them. Tsela's hand, surprisingly warm despite her obvious weakness, reached out to touch Naliné's face. "Listen to me carefully, granddaughter. There are things I must tell you while I still have breath to speak them." She paused, gathering strength for words that would reshape everything Naliné thought she knew about their life together. "The blanket that covers me holds more than warmth. When I am gone, you must examine it with the same care you would use to track a deer through new snow." The wind howled with renewed fury, as if the desert itself was protesting Tsela's departure. Inside the tent, the small fire flickered and danced, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward the two women like dark fingers. Naliné pulled her own shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from a growing sense that the world was about to change in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. "I don't understand," Naliné said, though part of her was beginning to suspect that her grandmother's cryptic evening stories had been preparing her for exactly this moment. "What secrets could a blanket hold?" Tsela's smile was gentle, but tinged with sadness. "The same kind of secrets that an old Apache woman might hide from people who think they know everything worth knowing." Her breathing became more labored, each word requiring effort that she could barely spare. "Remember what I taught you about appearances? About how the most valuable things are often hidden in the most humble places." As the hours passed, Tsela's condition deteriorated with the merciful swiftness that sometimes accompanies the final stages of illness. She spoke in fragments, sometimes in Apache, sometimes in English, sharing memories and instructions that seemed to flow from her like water from a broken dam. She told Naliné about her own grandmother, who had hidden family treasures from soldiers who came to force the Apache onto reservations. She spoke of a time when cooperation between Apache and white prospectors had been possible, before fear and greed had poisoned the relationships between peoples. "What lies beneath?" she whispered as dawn began to filter through the tent walls, revealing the extent of the storm's fury in the debris scattered across their small living space. "Always remember to look for what lies beneath." By mid-morning, as the wind finally began to subside and the first curious townspeople ventured out to assess the storm's damage, Tsela's breathing had grown so shallow that Naliné had to lean close to detect any sign of life. The older woman's eyes remained clear, though, fixed on her granddaughter's face with an intensity that spoke of final instructions being transmitted through bonds deeper than words. "The tent has been our shelter," Tsela said, her voice now so quiet that Naliné had to strain to hear her. "But you must not let them drive you from this place until you understand why I chose to stay here for so long." "Promise me." "I promise, grandmother," Naliné replied, tears making tracks down her cheeks. "But please don't leave me alone. I don't know how to survive without you." Tsela's hand tightened around her granddaughter's with surprising strength. "You are stronger than you know and smarter than they suspect. Everything you need I have given you, though you may not recognize the gifts until the time comes to use them." Her eyes closed for a moment, then opened again with what would be her final burst of clarity. "They called me crazy, said I wasted everything. Let them continue to think so until you are ready to show them how wrong they have been." The end came peacefully, with Tsela's hand still clasping Naliné's and the beautiful woven blanket pulled up to her chin. Her face, so often marked by the strain of surviving in a hostile environment, relaxed into an expression of profound peace. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a desert that sparkled with an almost magical clarity, as if the wind had washed the very air clean. Naliné sat in silence for nearly an hour, holding her grandmother's still warm hand and trying to absorb the magnitude of her loss. The tent, which had always felt like a secure refuge when shared with Tsela's presence, now seemed impossibly fragile and empty. But even in her grief, Naliné found herself remembering her grandmother's final words about the blanket, about things hidden beneath the surface, about the importance of not letting appearances deceive her. When Sheriff Morrison arrived shortly after noon, drawn by reports from townspeople who had noticed the absence of smoke from the tent's chimney, He found Naliné sitting beside her grandmother's body with a composure that surprised him. Morrison had expected to find a hysterical young woman in need of assistance, not someone who seemed to be approaching tragedy with the kind of quiet dignity that had characterized Tsela herself. "Sorry for your loss," Morrison said, removing his hat in a gesture that was more automatic than heartfelt. His eyes moved quickly around the tent's interior, taking inventory of possessions that he assumed would be worthless, but that protocol required him to catalogue. "I'll need to make arrangements for the burial, and then we'll have to discuss what happens to this site." Naliné looked up at him with eyes that held more steel than sorrow. "My grandmother will be buried according to Apache customs. As for the site, I believe you'll find that our legal right to be here is well documented." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. In all his interactions with Tsela over the years, she had never mentioned any legal documentation, and he had assumed that her presence was tolerated rather than authorized. "Legal documentation? I'm not aware of any such paperwork." "Then perhaps you haven't been looking in the right places," Naliné replied, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been amusement under different circumstances. "My grandmother was more careful about such matters than people realized." After Morrison departed, promising to return later with more questions and fewer sympathies, Naliné turned her attention to the blanket that covered Tsela's body. Her grandmother's final words echoed in her mind as she examined the textile with new eyes, looking for details that she might have overlooked during all the years it had simply been part of their daily life. What she discovered made her heart race with a combination of excitement and apprehension. Hidden within the blanket's intricate patterns were small pockets, so cleverly integrated into the design that they were nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. These pockets, sewn with the same meticulous care that characterized all of Tsela's handwork, contained items that would begin Naliné's education in just how thoroughly she had underestimated her grandmother's capabilities. The first pocket yielded 3 small gold nuggets, each one roughly the size of a child's thumbnail and bearing the distinctive markings that identified them as placer gold from local streams. The second contained a piece of folded paper covered with Apache symbols that Naliné recognized from her grandmother's evening stories, though their meaning in this context was not immediately clear. The third pocket held something that made Naliné's breath catch in her throat, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be uncut gemstones that gleamed with an inner fire even in the tent's dim light as she sat, surrounded by these tangible proofs that her grandmother had been harboring secrets of immense value. Naliné began to understand that Tsela's death marked not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything the people of Copper Creek thought they knew about the crazy Apache woman who had endured their contempt with such remarkable patience. This beautiful woven blanket that had provided Tsela's final comfort was revealing itself to be something far more significant than anyone had suspected, a repository of wealth and information that had been hidden in plain sight for years, waiting for the right moment and the right person to unlock its secrets. As the desert sun reached its peak and began its descent toward evening, Naliné found herself faced with decisions that would determine not just her own future, but her grandmother's true legacy. 3 days after Tsela's burial in the small cemetery that overlooked Copper Creek's eastern ridge, Naliné began her methodical search of the tent with the patience her grandmother had spent 17 years teaching her. The funeral had been a sparse affair, attended primarily by Miguel Santos, the Mexican prospector who had always treated Tsela with quiet respect, and Sarah McKenna, one of the few white women in town who had occasionally sought Tsela's help with difficult childbirths and stubborn ailments. The townspeople had maintained their distance even in death, though Naliné noticed how their eyes followed her movements with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Dutch Henley had made pointed comments about the need to clean up the area now that the old woman was gone, while Sheriff Morrison had begun making daily visits to inquire about Naliné's plans for the future. The pressure to abandon the tent and leave Copper Creek was mounting with each passing day, but Tsela's final words about looking beneath the surface had taken root in Naliné's mind like seeds planted in fertile ground. As she carefully examined every inch of their modest shelter, she began to discover a sophistication in her grandmother's arrangements that spoke of planning far beyond simple survival. What had appeared to be random placement of possessions revealed itself to be a carefully orchestrated system of concealment. The tent's floor, which Naliné had helped sweep and maintain for years, proved to be the first major revelation. Beneath a section of worn canvas that seemed no different from any other part of the flooring, her fingers detected a slight irregularity in the packed earth underneath. Working carefully with a kitchen knife, she pried up boards that had been so perfectly fitted that their edges were nearly invisible. What lay beneath took her breath away, a collection of hand-carved wooden pieces that initially resembled children's toys but revealed themselves to be something far more significant upon closer examination. Each piece of wood bore intricate carvings that combined Apache symbols with what appeared to be topographical markings, creating three-dimensional maps that documented the surrounding canyon system with remarkable precision. The largest piece, carved from a section of oak that must have taken months to shape and detail, showed the main canyon that ran behind Copper Creek's mining district. But unlike any map Naliné had ever seen, this one included layers of information that spoke of intimate knowledge gained through years of careful exploration. Depths were indicated by varying carving techniques, water sources were marked with tiny turquoise inlays, and mineral deposits were suggested through the use of different types of wood that had been fitted together like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. As she studied the wooden maps by lamplight, Naliné began to recognize landmarks from the stories Tsela had told during their evening conversations. The Eagle's Nest Canyon, where heroes had supposedly hidden treasure from enemies, was clearly depicted in one section of the carving. The place where water sings over stones that had featured in stories about ancestral spirits corresponded to a carefully marked location on the main map, but it was the presence of recent tool marks on the wood that truly captured Naliné's attention. Some of the carvings were clearly old, bearing the patina that came from years of handling and age. Others, however, showed signs of recent modification, fresh cuts in the wood that suggested Tsela had been updating these maps continuously, adding new information as recently as the weeks before her death. The realization that her grandmother had been actively exploring the canyon system while maintaining the fiction of being a helpless old woman struck Naliné with the force of revelation. Every time Tsela had claimed to be gathering herbs or visiting sacred sites to pray for guidance, she had actually been conducting surveys that would have impressed professional prospectors. Miguel Santos arrived at the tent just as Naliné was beginning to process the implications of her discovery. The weathered Mexican prospector, whose respect for Tsela had always puzzled the other townspeople, knocked gently on the tent pole and waited for permission to enter, a courtesy that few white visitors ever bothered to observe. "I have been thinking about your grandmother since the funeral," Miguel said, settling onto one of the wooden crates that served as seating. His eyes, dark and intelligent, took in the wooden maps without surprise, though he nodded with something that might have been approval. She was not what people believed her to be. Naliné studied Miguel's weathered face, trying to determine how much he actually knew about Tsela's activities. "What do you mean?" Miguel's smile held a mixture of sadness and admiration. "Your grandmother asked me many questions over the years. Questions about geology, about how to identify promising rock formations, about which canyons had been thoroughly explored, and which had been overlooked by the American prospectors." He paused, his fingers tracing the air above one of the wooden maps without actually touching it. "I thought she was simply curious, the way some people are curious about things they will never experience themselves. I did not realize she was conducting her own investigations." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from their small fire. Naliné felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. Here was confirmation that Tsela's activities had extended far beyond what anyone in Copper Creek had suspected, but also evidence that others might have noticed more than they had revealed. "She never told me about any of this," Naliné said, gesturing toward the wooden maps. "I thought I knew everything about her life, but it seems I knew almost nothing." "Perhaps she was protecting you," Miguel suggested. "Or perhaps she was waiting for the right time to share her discoveries. Your grandmother was a woman who understood the value of patience." Over the next hour, Miguel shared details about his interactions with Tsela that painted a picture of a woman far more sophisticated and knowledgeable than anyone had imagined. She had questioned him about the mining techniques that worked best in different types of rock formations. She had asked about the markets for various minerals and how one might go about selling small quantities without attracting unwanted attention. Most significantly, she had inquired about the legal requirements for filing mining claims and the procedures for establishing legitimate ownership of mineral rights. "I thought these were theoretical questions," Miguel admitted. "I assumed she was simply trying to understand the world that surrounded her. But looking at these maps, I believe your grandmother was planning something far more ambitious than any of us realized." As evening approached and Miguel prepared to leave, he paused at the tent entrance with a troubled expression. "There is something else you should know," he said quietly. "Dutch Henley has been asking questions about your grandmother's activities. He wants to know if anyone ever saw her in the canyons, if she ever showed signs of having access to money beyond what her occasional work would provide." The warning sent a chill through Naliné that had nothing to do with the desert's evening coolness. Dutch Henley's interest in their affairs could only mean that rumors were beginning to circulate, that the careful facade Tsela had maintained for 20 years was starting to crack now that she was no longer there to reinforce it. "What should I do?" Naliné asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Her grandmother's lessons in patience and observation had been preparing her for exactly this situation. "Be very careful who you trust," Miguel replied. "And remember that your grandmother chose to live in this particular spot for reasons that went far beyond simple shelter. Before you decide what to do with these maps, you might want to discover what she could see from here that made this location so valuable to her." After Miguel departed, Naliné stood outside the tent in the growing darkness, looking out over Copper Creek with eyes that were beginning to see the landscape the way her grandmother had seen it. The tent's position on the slight rise at the edge of town provided clear sightlines to the main road, the mining district, and the mouth of the canyon system that was depicted in such careful detail on the wooden maps. For the first time, she understood that Tsela's tent had not been a refuge for someone cast out by society. It had been a carefully chosen observation post for someone conducting a long-term investigation into the true wealth hidden in the Arizona Territory's rugged landscape. The leather-bound ledger revealed itself 3 days later, hidden within a false bottom of the wooden crate that had always held Tsela's sewing supplies. Naliné discovered it purely by accident when the crate's bottom board cracked under the weight of grief-driven reorganization, exposing a compartment that had been invisible for all the years she had helped her grandmother retrieve needles and thread from the same container. The ledger itself was a thing of beauty and precision that spoke of resources far beyond what anyone in Copper Creek would have. Attributed to an impoverished Apache woman, the leather binding was soft and supple, marked with the kind of careful stitching that suggested expensive craftsmanship. The pages within were filled with columns of numbers, dates and locations written in Tsela's careful script, a script that revealed her literacy to be far more sophisticated than the simple reading and writing skills she had taught Naliné. What the ledger contained challenged every assumption about their life together. Page after page documented systematic gold extractions from locations that corresponded precisely to the wooden maps Naliné had discovered earlier. But these were not the random findings of someone lucky enough to stumble across a few nuggets. They were the methodical records of a mining operation that had been conducted with scientific precision over a period of nearly 2 decades. The earliest entries dated back to 1867, just 1 year after Tsela had arrived in Copper Creek with her infant granddaughter. Even in those first months, when she had supposedly been struggling to establish the most basic shelter and survival routines, Tsela had been documenting gold extractions that ranged from small nuggets worth a few dollars to occasional discoveries that represented weeks of wages for the average miner. But it was the financial calculations that truly took Naliné's breath away. Tsela had not been randomly collecting whatever gold she could find. She had been systematically working claims that produced consistent yields month after month, year after year. The ledger showed total extractions that, even by conservative estimates, represented thousands of dollars in accumulated wealth. More shocking still were the records of transactions with buyers, whose names Naliné recognized from letters that occasionally arrived at the Copper Creek post office. Tsela had been selling her gold to dealers in Phoenix, Tucson, and even as far away as San Francisco, using a network of contacts that suggested connections far beyond the isolated existence she had appeared to maintain. The ledger also contained information that had nothing to do with mining, but everything to do with survival in a hostile environment. Tsela had documented the comings and goings of Copper Creek's residents with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. She knew which miners were struggling financially, which businesses were operating outside the law, and which officials could be trusted to honor their stated commitments. Dutch Henley featured prominently in these observations, with entries that detailed his practice of manipulating land records to acquire properties from desperate sellers at far below market value. Sheriff Morrison appeared frequently as well, with notations about his tendency to overlook certain crimes in exchange for financial considerations that were never officially reported. Even banker Samuel Whitmore was documented as having engaged in practices that would have scandalized his respectable clientele. As Naliné absorbed the implications of her grandmother's record-keeping, she began to understand that Tsela had been accumulating far more than gold during her years in Copper Creek. She had been gathering information that could destroy reputations, end careers, and potentially lead to criminal prosecutions for some of the town's most influential citizens. The ledger's most recent entries, dated just weeks before Tsela's death, contained calculations that suggested she had been preparing for a major change in strategy. There were references to legal consultations, correspondence with attorneys in Phoenix, and what appeared to be preliminary steps toward filing formal mining claims that would establish legal ownership of the sites she had been working in. Secret Miguel Santos arrived at the tent that evening as if summoned by Naliné's need for someone who could help her process the magnitude of her discoveries. The Mexican prospector's expression grew increasingly serious as Naliné shared selected portions of the ledger's contents, though his surprise seemed more focused on the scale of Tsela's operations than on the fact that they had existed at all. "I suspected your grandmother was more resourceful than she appeared," Miguel said, carefully examining the ledger's documentation of extraction sites. "But this represents the work of someone with extensive geological knowledge and considerable business sophistication. These are not the random discoveries of an amateur prospector." Naliné found herself wrestling with emotions that ranged from pride in her grandmother's accomplishments to confusion about why such important information had been kept secret. Why didn't she tell me about any of this? I could have helped her, could have shared the burden of maintaining these records. Miguel's weathered hands traced the air above the ledger pages without touching them, as if the information they contained was too valuable to risk damaging through careless handling. Perhaps she was protecting you from knowledge that could have put you in danger. Or perhaps she was waiting for you to be old enough to handle the responsibilities that would come with this inheritance. The word inheritance hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Until that moment, Naliné had been thinking of her discoveries as fascinating revelations about her grandmother's hidden life. The realization that Tsela had been building something specifically intended to be passed on transformed the ledger from a historical curiosity into a roadmap for her own future. "There's something else," Miguel said quietly. "Dutch Henley came to see me today. He wanted to know if I had ever observed your grandmother in the canyon areas, if I had any knowledge of her activities beyond the occasional herb gathering that everyone assumed explained her absences from town. The news sent a chill through Naliné that had nothing to do with the desert's evening coolness." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that your grandmother was a woman who kept her own counsel, and that I respected her privacy too much to speculate about her personal activities." Miguel's expression grew troubled, but his questions were very specific, Naliné. He asked about mining equipment, about whether I had ever seen her with tools that would be inappropriate for someone simply gathering plants for medicinal purposes. The implications were clear, somehow. Word of Tsela's activities was beginning to circulate among the very people who had the most to lose if her information gathering became public knowledge. The careful balance she had maintained between apparent powerlessness and actual influence was shifting now that she was no longer there to maintain the illusion. "I think your grandmother knew this day would come," Miguel continued. The timing of her legal consultations, the way she had been updating her records right up until her final illness. She was preparing to transition from secret accumulation to public action. As they sat in the tense, warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by evidence of Tsela's remarkable double life, Naliné felt the weight of inheritance settling on her shoulders. The ledger represented not just wealth and information, but responsibility. Her grandmother had spent 20 years building something important, and now it fell to Naliné to decide what to do with the legacy she had been left. "Miguel," she said finally, "I need to see these mining sites for myself. I need to understand exactly what my grandmother was working with before I can decide how to honor her efforts." The older man nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "I will help you, but we must be very careful. If Dutch Henley and his associates are beginning to suspect the truth about your grandmother's activities, then your safety may depend on how carefully we proceed." Outside the tent, the desert night settled over Copper Creek with its usual quiet intensity. But for the first time since Tsela's death, Naliné felt something other than grief and uncertainty. She felt the stirring of purpose, the beginning of understanding that her grandmother's legacy was not just about gold or information. It was about the power that came from patience, observation, and the willingness to let others underestimate your capabilities while you quietly built something that could change everything. The silver compass, with its distinctive Apache markings, emerged from Tsela's most private possessions on a morning when the desert air carried the promise of approaching winter. Naliné found it wrapped in soft deerskin at the bottom of a parfleche container that had always been treated with special reverence. Though her grandmother had never explained why this particular item deserved such careful protection, the compass itself was a masterpiece of blended craftsmanship that spoke of two worlds, meeting in harmony rather than conflict. The silver case bore the precise engravings typical of American instrument makers, but these had been enhanced with traditional Apache symbols that transformed the utilitarian device into something approaching sacred art. Tiny turquoise inlays marked the cardinal directions, while careful etching depicted the spiral patterns that represented life's journey in her people's traditional understanding. But what made the compass truly extraordinary was its obvious age and the evidence of heavy use. This was not a decorative piece created for display. It was a working instrument that had guided someone through countless journeys across challenging terrain. The silver case showed the kind of wear that came from being carried in weather that ranged from desert heat to mountain snow, and the magnetic needle still responded with the precision that marked quality craftsmanship. When Naliné opened the compass case, She discovered an inscription engraved on the inside cover in a mixture of English and Apache script. "For my daughter Ayana, may you always find your way home." From your father, Running Bear, 1845. The realization that this compass had belonged to her great-grandfather, a man whose stories had filled her childhood with visions of a time when Apache guides had worked alongside white explorers, added layers of significance that went far beyond its practical value. Miguel Santos examined the compass with the reverence due to both its craftsmanship and its history when Naliné showed it to him during their first expedition into the canyon system. "This belonged to Running Bear?" he asked, his voice reflecting the awe that Apache elders still inspired among those who remembered the days when their knowledge of the land was valued rather than feared. "My grandmother's father," Naliné confirmed, watching as Miguel carefully tested the compass's accuracy against his own modern instrument. "She never told me she had inherited it, though she often spoke of his skill as a guide and his knowledge of the hidden places in these mountains. They were standing at the mouth of the canyon that had been most prominently featured in Tsela's wooden maps, a narrow passage between towering red rock walls that seemed to glow with internal fire in the morning sunlight. The compass readings aligned perfectly with the topographical details that Tsela had carved into her wooden maps, confirming that her surveys had been conducted with professional-level precision. As they followed the compass directions deeper into the canyon system, Naliné began to understand the true scope of her grandmother's secret activities. Hidden caches of mining equipment revealed themselves in locations that would have been invisible to casual exploration. Hand tools of excellent quality were stored in natural caves that had been selected for their protection from weather, and their concealment from prying eyes more impressive. Still were the signs of systematic excavation that had been conducted with careful attention to both efficiency and secrecy. Tsela had been working multiple sites simultaneously, rotating her efforts to avoid creating obvious signs of activity that might attract unwanted attention. The compass had clearly been essential to this operation, allowing her to navigate between widely separated locations with the confidence that came from precise navigation. Your grandmother was conducting a mining operation that would have impressed professional prospectors, Miguel observed as they examined a carefully disguised shaft that descended into promising rock formations. This level of organization and planning suggests knowledge that went far beyond what most people acquire through casual observation. The evidence of Tsela's sophisticated approach to mining was overwhelming, but it was the discovery of her processing sites that truly revealed the extent of her capabilities. Hidden in natural chambers that could only be accessed through passages that required intimate knowledge of the canyon's geography, she had established locations where raw ore could be processed into the refined gold that had filled the ledger with impressive transaction records. These processing sites contained equipment that represented significant investment and considerable expertise in its selection and use. Rock crushers, sluice boxes, and mercury amalgamation apparatus had been transported into locations so remote that their presence suggested both substantial financial resources and access to transportation methods that had escaped the notice of Copper Creek's gossip network. The compass proved to be more than just a navigation tool. It was the key to understanding a network of sites that had been planned and developed over the course of nearly 2 decades. Each location served a specific purpose in an overall operation that demonstrated Tsela's mastery of both the technical aspects of gold mining and the strategic considerations necessary for maintaining secrecy in a small community where everyone's business was typically everyone else's concern. As they explored deeper into the canyon system, following compass bearings that led to increasingly sophisticated installations, Naliné found herself developing a new understanding of her grandmother's character. The woman who had appeared to be surviving on the margins of society had actually been operating a business enterprise that would have been impressive even by the standards of Copper Creek's most successful mining operators. But it was the discovery of Tsela's observation posts that revealed the true genius of her approach. Strategically positioned lookouts provided clear sightlines to the main approaches to her mining sites, allowing her to monitor potential intrusions while she worked. The compass had been essential to establishing these positions, ensuring that each observation post was optimally located to provide maximum security for the operation as a whole. "She thought of everything," Naliné said as they examined one of these lookout positions, which had been equipped with supplies that would allow someone to maintain surveillance for extended periods. No wonder she was able to keep her activities secret for so long. Miguel nodded, his expression reflecting growing admiration for Tsela's planning and execution. "Your grandmother understood that the greatest treasure is often the one that remains hidden until the right moment for revelation arrives." She was not just accumulating gold, she was building a legacy that could transform your life when the time was right. The afternoon was growing late when they made their most significant discovery. Following compass bearings to a location that had been marked with special symbols on Tsela's wooden maps, they found themselves standing before a natural cave system that had been modified with such skill that the alterations were nearly invisible to casual observation. Inside the main chamber, protected from weather and hidden from anyone who lacked precise navigation instructions, was evidence of the most sophisticated mining operation any of them had imagined possible. This was not simply a site where Tsela had extracted gold from existing deposits. It was a location where she had been developing new veins that promised yields far greater than anything documented in her carefully maintained ledger. As they stood in the chamber that represented the culmination of 20 years of patient planning and systematic development, Naliné felt the full weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders. The compass that had guided her great-grandfather through a different kind of frontier had been passed down through generations to guide her toward an understanding of possibilities that extended far beyond survival. The silver compass, with its Apache markings, had revealed itself to be more than a navigation instrument. It was a bridge between the traditional knowledge of her ancestors and the practical requirements of thriving in a world that offered few opportunities for people like her. In her hands, it would become the tool that connected past wisdom with future possibilities, just as it had been for the remarkable woman who had entrusted it to her care. The bundle of legal documents changed everything Naliné thought she understood about her grandmother's relationship with the white man's world. Hidden beneath a false bottom in the metal box that had always held their most important papers, these documents revealed a level of legal sophistication that challenged every assumption about Tsela's supposed isolation from mainstream society. The papers themselves were impressive in their official weight and complexity. Formal mining claims filed with the territorial government, property deeds executed with proper legal witnesses, and correspondence with law firms in Phoenix and Tucson created a picture of someone who had not only understood the Anglo legal system, but had mastered it sufficiently to protect substantial interests over a period of many years. The earliest document, dated 1868, established Tsela's legal ownership of the small parcel of land where her tent had been situated. But this was no casual squatter's claim. It was a properly filed homestead entry that had been processed through the Territorial Land Office with all the bureaucratic precision that such transactions required. More impressive still, the documentation showed that all required improvements and residency obligations had been meticulously fulfilled, creating unassailable legal title to property that everyone in Copper Creek had assumed she occupied only through unofficial tolerance. But the homestead claim was merely the foundation for a much more ambitious legal strategy. Over the following years, Tsela had filed additional mining claims that covered virtually every significant site that she had been working in secret. These claims had been staked, surveyed, and registered according to the strict requirements of territorial mining law, creating legal ownership of mineral rights that extended far beyond what anyone had suspected. The correspondence with lawyers revealed the existence of a sophisticated support network that had helped Tsela navigate the complexities of territorial law and federal mining regulations. Letters from the Phoenix law firm of Henderson and Associates discussed strategies for protecting Apache land rights through creative use of homestead laws and mining claim procedures. Other correspondence addressed the specific challenges faced by Native Americans in establishing legal standing in territorial courts. What impressed Naliné most was the evidence of careful, long-term planning that had guided Tsela's legal strategy. Rather than simply filing claims and hoping for the best, she had worked with her legal advisors to create a framework that would protect her interests against various challenges that might arise. Contingency plans addressed everything from potential disputes with neighboring claimants to strategies for defending against discriminatory enforcement of territorial laws. The financial records included in the legal documentation provided context for Tsela's ability to afford such sophisticated legal representation. Regular payments to Henderson and Associates, documented over a period of 15 years, showed that she had been investing substantial portions of her mining proceeds in legal protection for her claims. This was not the desperate gamble of someone hoping to strike it rich. It was the calculated strategy of someone building a business that could survive legal challenges and provide long-term security. Sarah McKenna's arrival at the tent that evening, bearing a pot of stew and wearing an expression of determined friendship, provided Naliné with an opportunity to test her growing understanding of her grandmother's true circumstances. The middle-aged Irish woman had been one of the few townspeople who had consistently treated Tsela with respect, though she had never explained the basis for her obvious affection and admiration. "I've been thinking about your grandmother since the funeral," Sarah said as she settled onto one of the wooden crates that served as seating. Her manner was more direct than usual, as if Tsela's death had removed some barrier that had previously constrained their conversations. "There are things about her that I think you should know. Things that might help you understand why certain people in this town are so interested in your plans." Naliné carefully arranged the legal documents on the small table that had always served for her grandmother's reading and writing activities. "What kinds of things?" Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the official seals and legal language that covered the papers spread before them. "My lord," she whispered. She really did have proper claims to all of this. Her expression shifted from surprise to something approaching relief. I wondered if she was taking terrible risks, but she had everything properly documented. The admission revealed that Sarah had known far more about Tsela's activities than she had ever acknowledged. Over the next hour, as they shared the simple meal Sarah had prepared, the full extent of this knowledge emerged in stories that painted a picture of careful collaboration between two women who had understood the value of maintaining discretionary silence. Sarah had served as Tsela's connection to the broader community of women who managed the social and economic networks that kept frontier towns functioning. Through Sarah's friendships with the wives of successful miners and businessmen, Tsela had gained access to information about which claims were being abandoned, which properties were available for purchase, and which legal strategies were proving successful for other mining operations. She asked me to keep track of conversations I overheard about mining law and territorial regulations, Sarah explained. I thought she was simply curious about the world that surrounded her, but now I understand that she was gathering information that she needed for her own legal planning. More significantly, Sarah had occasionally served as Tsela's representative in situations where an Apache woman's direct participation would have attracted unwanted attention. Legal documents needed to be filed in the territorial capital. Correspondence needed to be posted to lawyers in distant cities, and financial transactions needed to be conducted with discretion that protected Tsela's carefully maintained public image. The lawyers knew her as Mrs. T. Yazzie, Sarah revealed. I helped her establish that identity so she could conduct business without having to deal with the prejudices that would have complicated her legal affairs if people knew they were dealing with an Apache woman. The revelation that Tsela had been operating under an assumed legal identity added another layer of sophistication to her strategy. The name T. appeared on all the official documents, creating a legal persona that could own property, file claims, and conduct business without the complications that would have arose from her true identity. As they examined the legal documents together, Sarah shared additional details about the network of support that had enabled Tsela's remarkable achievements. Sympathetic clerks in the Territorial Land Office had provided guidance on proper filing procedures. Bank officials in Phoenix had established accounts that allowed Mrs. T. to conduct financial transactions without having to appear in person. Even some of the lawyers who had never met Tsela personally had been willing to work with her through correspondence, because her legal questions demonstrated sophisticated understanding and her payments were always prompt and sufficient. She understood that the law could be either a weapon used against her people or a shield that could protect them, Sarah explained. She chose to master it well enough to make it work in her favor. But she also knew that success would depend on maintaining discretion until she was ready to reveal her achievements. The conversation revealed that Tsela's legal strategy had extended beyond her own interests to encompass broader goals related to Apache land rights and economic development. Correspondence with other tribal leaders suggested that she had been part of a network of Native Americans who were using legal means to protect tribal lands and establish legitimate business enterprises. As the evening progressed and they continued to explore the implications of Tsela's legal accomplishments, Naliné found herself developing a new appreciation for the complexity of her grandmother's character. The woman who had appeared to be enduring the contempt of Copper Creek's residents had actually been building a legal fortress that could protect not just her own interests, but the future prospects of her granddaughter and potentially other Apache families as well. The bundle of legal documents represented more than just proof of ownership. It was evidence of a master plan that had been 20 years in the making. Tsela had not simply been surviving in a hostile environment. She had been systematically building the legal foundation for a transformation that would challenge everything the people of Copper Creek thought they knew about power, wealth, and the proper place of Apache people in territorial society. The photographic evidence emerged from a leather portfolio that Naliné discovered wedged behind the tent's support poles in a location so concealed that only someone dismantling the entire structure would have found it. The portfolio itself was expensive leather, reinforced with brass corners and secured with a lock that required the small key Naliné had found among her grandmother's most private possessions. Inside were daguerreotypes that completely reframed everything she thought she knew about Tsela's life in Copper Creek. The images showed her grandmother in circumstances that challenged every assumption about her supposed isolation and poverty. Here was Tsela in fine clothing, seated in elegant parlors beside well-dressed businessmen whose faces radiated prosperity and confidence. Here she was, standing in front of impressive buildings in what appeared to be Phoenix or Tucson, accompanied by men in expensive suits who treated her with obvious respect and deference. But the most shocking image showed Tsela in traditional Apache dress, standing in a formal group with other Native American leaders and several white officials in what was clearly some kind of important governmental meeting. The careful staging and formal poses suggested this was an official occasion of considerable significance, not a casual gathering or tourist curiosity. Each photograph was carefully labeled in Tsela's meticulous handwriting, with dates and locations that documented a secret life spanning nearly 2 decades. Meeting with Henderson and Associates regarding territorial mining rights, Phoenix, October 1878. Apache Business Council Conference with Territorial Officials, Tucson, May 1882. Investment consultation with Morrison Banking Group, Phoenix, March 1884. The realization that her grandmother had been living a sophisticated double life left Naliné feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted fundamentally. The woman who had appeared to be surviving on society's margins had actually been operating at the highest levels of territorial business and politics, maintaining relationships that extended far beyond anything anyone in Copper Creek had imagined possible. Letters found in the same portfolio provided context that made the photographs even more remarkable. Correspondence from prominent businessmen addressed Mrs. Yazzie as a valued business partner whose advice and investment capabilities were clearly respected. Government officials wrote to her about policies affecting Apache land rights and economic development opportunities. Lawyers discussed complex legal strategies that positioned her as a sophisticated client rather than a charity case in need of basic assistance. But it was a letter from the Territorial Governor's Office that truly revealed the scope of Tsela's influence and activities. The formal communication, dated just 6 months before her death, thanked her for her continued efforts to facilitate peaceful economic development that benefits both Apache communities and territorial growth, and invited her to participate in upcoming discussions regarding the establishment of reservation-based mining enterprises. The documents revealed that Tsela had been part of a network of Apache leaders who were working to establish legitimate business enterprises that could provide economic security for their people within the framework of territorial law, rather than simply accepting the displacement and poverty that had been the fate of many Native American communities. They were using legal and financial strategies to create sustainable alternatives. Investment records showed that Tsela's mining proceeds had been used for far more than personal survival. She had been providing financial support for Apache families throughout the territory, helping to fund legal challenges to discriminatory policies, and investing in business ventures that employed Native American workers in legitimate enterprises. Most remarkably, the documents revealed that several of Copper Creek's most successful mining operations had actually been financed with capital that Tsela had provided through intermediaries. The very men who mocked her supposed poverty were prospering, with the help of investments that she had made through carefully constructed legal entities that concealed her involvement. Miguel Santos's reaction to these discoveries confirmed that the network of Apache business leaders had been operating with sufficient discretion to avoid detection even by sympathetic observers. "I knew your grandmother was more than she appeared," he said, as they examined the photographs together. "But this suggests she was operating at a level of sophistication that would have impressed any territorial businessman." The photographs also revealed the true purpose behind Tsela's careful observation of Copper Creek's residents and their activities. She had not been simply gathering gossip or satisfying curiosity. She had been conducting intelligence gathering that supported a broader strategy for protecting Apache economic interests throughout the region. Detailed reports found among the papers documented corrupt practices by territorial officials, discriminatory enforcement of mining laws, and systematic efforts to defraud Native American landowners of their legitimate property rights. Tsela had been building legal cases that could challenge these practices, using evidence gathered through her seemingly powerless position as an overlooked observer. The scope of the corruption that Tsela had documented was breathtaking in its extent and systematic nature. Sheriff Morrison appeared in multiple reports as someone who had accepted payments to overlook illegal mining activities on Apache lands. Dutch Henley was documented as having manipulated land records to acquire properties at far below market value, often from Apache families who were not informed of their legal rights. Banker Samuel Whitmore had been facilitating financial fraud that diverted Apache trust funds into private accounts, controlled by territorial officials. But perhaps most shocking was the evidence that these corrupt practices were part of a coordinated effort by a group of territorial officials and businessmen to systematically transfer Apache land and mineral rights to private ownership through legal manipulation and bureaucratic deception. The network included judges, land office clerks, and even some federal Indian agents who were supposed to be protecting Native American interests. Tsela's position as the crazy Apache woman living in poverty on the edge of Copper Creek had been the perfect cover for gathering evidence about these activities. No one suspected that someone with no apparent resources or connections could pose any threat to their schemes, so they conducted their illegal business with minimal discretion. Whenever she was within earshot, the photographs revealed that this intelligence gathering had been coordinated with other Apache leaders who were positioned throughout the territory to document similar activities in their own communities. The network had been building legal cases that could expose the entire conspiracy and potentially result in criminal prosecutions that would destroy the careers and reputations of some of the territory's most powerful men. Letters from federal officials in Washington suggested that the evidence Tsela and her collaborators had gathered was being reviewed by authorities who had the power to initiate federal investigations and prosecutions. The corruption they had documented potentially violated federal laws protecting tribal rights, and the systematic nature of the conspiracy suggested that territorial officials might have been exceeding their legal authority in ways that warranted federal intervention. As Naliné absorbed the implications of these discoveries, she began to understand that her grandmother's death had occurred at a crucial moment in the implementation of a plan that had been years in development. The legal documentation, the evidence of corruption, and the network of Apache business leaders had all been building toward a moment when the true extent of Tsela's capabilities and resources would be revealed in a way that could transform the relationship between Native American communities and territorial society. The photographs and accompanying documents revealed that the tent had not been a refuge for someone cast out by society. It had been the operational headquarters for someone conducting a sophisticated campaign to protect Apache rights and interests. Throughout the Arizona Territory, the mockery and contempt that Tsela had endured from Copper Creek's residents had been the price she paid for maintaining a cover that allowed her to gather the evidence needed to challenge the very system that oppressed her people. The realization that "you wasted everything" had been exactly wrong left Naliné feeling as if she was seeing her grandmother clearly for the first time. Tsela had not wasted anything. She had sacrificed her public dignity and personal comfort to build something far more valuable than the gold she had extracted from hidden mines. She had constructed a legacy that could protect future generations of Apache people from the legal and economic discrimination that had characterized their treatment by territorial authorities. Standing in the tent that had sheltered this remarkable woman's secret life, surrounded by evidence of achievements that would have impressed any territorial businessman, Naliné felt the full weight of her inheritance settling on her shoulders. She had inherited not just wealth and property, but a mission that extended far beyond her own interests, to encompass the welfare of Apache communities throughout the region. Tsela's strategic journal emerged from its hiding place like a final message from beyond the grave. Discovered tucked between the canvas layers of the tent wall in a location so perfectly concealed that only someone following the precise instructions left in her final personal effects would have found it. The journal itself was bound in oiled leather that had protected it from decades of desert weather, and its pages contained what amounted to a comprehensive manual for navigating the challenges that Naliné now faced. The opening entry, dated just 3 months before Tsela's death, revealed that she had been preparing for exactly this transition, with the same meticulous planning that had characterized all her other activities. If Naliné is reading this, then my time for hidden work has ended, and hers for open action has begun. Everything I have built was created to serve this moment, when the truth can finally emerge without destroying those it was meant to protect. The journal contained detailed instructions for safely claiming the inheritance and transforming it from hidden assets into legitimate defensible wealth. Tsela had anticipated every challenge that might arise, from legal complications to physical threats, and had developed strategies for addressing each potential obstacle. Her plans revealed the mind of someone who had thought several moves ahead in a complex game that most people didn't even realize was being played. Names and addresses of trusted allies filled multiple pages, creating a network of support that extended throughout the Arizona territory and beyond. Lawyers in Phoenix and Tucson, who had been working with the Apache business network for years, were identified as people who could provide immediate legal assistance. Businessmen who had been secret partners in various investment ventures were noted as potential sources of financial backing and political influence. Perhaps most importantly, the journal contained evidence that had been carefully compiled against Dutch Henley, Sheriff Morrison, and the network of territorial officials who had been systematically defrauding Apache landowners. This evidence was so comprehensive and well documented that it could support criminal prosecutions that would destroy their careers and potentially result in federal prison sentences. Dutch Henley believes he owns this town, one entry noted, but his ownership is built on fraudulent land transfers and systematic corruption that violates both territorial and federal law. The documentation I have gathered, combined with testimony from witnesses who can verify the illegal activities, will be sufficient to trigger federal investigations that he cannot survive. The journal also revealed that other Apache families throughout the territory were depending on the exposure of this corruption to recover lands and resources that had been stolen from them through legal manipulation. Tsela's work had been part of a coordinated effort to document systematic discrimination and fraud that affected hundreds of Native American families, and her evidence was crucial to legal strategies that could recover millions of dollars in stolen assets. Miguel Santos arrived at the tent that evening as if summoned by the gravity of the situation, bringing with him a Mexican lawyer named Carlos Mendoza, who had been working with the Apache business network to prepare for the legal confrontations that were now imminent. Mendoza's presence added a new dimension of professional competence to their planning, and his familiarity with territorial law provided the expertise needed to transform Tsela's evidence into legally actionable documentation. "Your grandmother contacted me 6 months ago," Mendoza explained as he examined the strategic journal and the supporting evidence that filled multiple boxes. She knew that her health was declining, and she wanted to ensure that her work could continue even if she was not able to see it through to completion herself. The lawyer's review of Tsela's documentation revealed that she had been building legal cases with the thoroughness of someone trained in legal procedure. Every piece of evidence was properly authenticated, witness statements were notarized and dated, and financial records were organized in a manner that would satisfy the most demanding legal standards. She understood that accusations without proper documentation would be dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled minority, Mendoza explained. But this level of evidence can support federal criminal charges that will be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Sarah McKenna joined their planning session that evening, bringing with her additional documentation that revealed the extent of her own involvement in Tsela's intelligence-gathering efforts. Over the years, she had been collecting information from the wives and families of Copper Creek's leading citizens, gathering details about business dealings and financial arrangements that had never been intended for public scrutiny. The women in this town know more about their husbands' business activities than the men realize. Sarah explained as she added her own carefully maintained records to the growing collection of evidence. Dutch Henley's wife has been worried about his illegal activities for years, and she's kept detailed records that she thought might protect her if his schemes ever collapsed. The revelation that Dutch, Henley's own wife, had been documenting his illegal activities added a new dimension to their legal strategy. Her records, combined with Tsela's external observations and the official documents that proved fraud and corruption, created a case that would be virtually impossible for territorial authorities to ignore or suppress. But the journal's most crucial information concerned the timing and sequence of events that would be necessary to ensure success while minimizing risks to the people involved. Tsela had understood that premature revelation of the evidence could result in retaliation against vulnerable Apache families, while delayed action might allow the corrupt officials to cover their tracks or destroy incriminating documentation. The federal authorities in Washington have been informed that significant evidence of territorial corruption would be made available at a specific time, Mendoza revealed. Your grandmother coordinated with other Apache leaders to ensure that this revelation would occur simultaneously across multiple communities, making it impossible for territorial officials to suppress or contain the scandal. The strategic coordination involved in Tsela's planning was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Apache business leaders in communities throughout the territory had been gathering similar evidence about local corruption, and their combined revelations would expose a pattern of systematic fraud that extended far beyond the activities of any individual official or community. Letters from federal officials suggested that Washington had been growing increasingly concerned about reports of territorial mismanagement and discrimination against Native American communities. The evidence that Tsela and her network had compiled would provide the documentation needed to justify federal intervention and potentially the removal of territorial officials who had been exceeding their legal authority. The journal also contained detailed plans for protecting the safety of everyone involved in the revelation process. Safe houses had been established in Phoenix and Tucson, where Apache families could be relocated if retaliation became a concern. Legal observers from Eastern newspapers and federal agencies had been invited to witness the proceedings to ensure that territorial authorities could not suppress or distort the evidence being presented. Your grandmother thought of everything, Miguel observed as they reviewed the comprehensive nature of Tsela's planning. She understood that this kind of confrontation with established power would require careful preparation and significant support from outside the territory. The financial aspects of Tsela's plan were equally sophisticated. The wealth she had accumulated through her mining operations would be used to fund legal challenges and provide economic support for Apache families whose livelihoods might be threatened by their participation in the legal proceedings. This financial backing would ensure that economic pressure could not be used to silence witnesses or discourage participation in the legal process. But perhaps most importantly, the journal revealed that Tsela's ultimate goal had been to establish precedents that would protect Apache land rights and economic interests throughout the American West. The legal victories they were seeking would create case law that could be applied in other territories and states where similar discrimination was occurring. As they worked through the evening, organizing evidence and refining their legal strategy, Naliné found herself transformed from a grieving granddaughter into the operational leader of a campaign that had been years in preparation. The journal's instructions were so detailed and comprehensive that she felt as if Tsela was still guiding her through every decision and consideration. The tent that had sheltered their simple life together had been revealed as the command center for an operation of remarkable sophistication and ambition. The maps, ledgers, photographs, and legal documents that filled every concealed space represented 20 years of patient preparation for a confrontation that would challenge the fundamental assumptions about power and justice in the Arizona territory. Tomorrow, we begin the process of filing formal legal challenges that will trigger federal investigations, Mendoza announced as their planning session concluded. The evidence your grandmother compiled will be presented to territorial authorities who will be forced to choose between voluntary cooperation and federal intervention. Outside the tent, The desert night settled over Copper Creek with its usual quiet intensity. But the town would never be the same after the events that were about to unfold. The crazy Apache woman, who had endured 20 years of mockery and contempt, was about to be revealed as someone who had been systematically building the legal foundation for a transformation that would reshape the relationship between Native American communities and territorial society, as Naliné prepared for sleep on what would be her last night as the keeper of hidden secrets. She felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility and purpose. Tomorrow, the truth would begin to emerge, and the people of Copper Creek would discover that their assumptions about power, wealth, and the proper place of Apache people in their society had been fundamentally wrong. The strategic journal had provided her with the roadmap for honoring Tsela's remarkable achievements while continuing the work that had defined her grandmother's hidden life. The tent that had been their humble shelter was about to become the launching point for a revelation that would echo throughout the territory and beyond, proving that sometimes the most powerful people are those who allow others to underestimate them while they quietly build something that can change everything. The official mining survey map arrived with the territorial delegation at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide the history of Copper Creek into before and after. The document itself was impressive in its official weight and governmental authority. Thick parchment bearing the seal of the United States Geological Survey, signed by federal officials whose names carried weight in Washington, and authenticated with the kind of bureaucratic precision that made legal challenges virtually impossible. Naliné stood in the center of Copper Creek's main street, flanked by Carlos Mendoza and 2 federal marshals who had arrived from Phoenix to ensure that territorial authorities could not interfere with the legal proceedings about to unfold. In her hands, she held not just the survey map, but copies of all the legal documents that would transform her from an overlooked Apache woman into one of the territory's most substantial property owners. Dutch Henley emerged from his saloon with the aggressive confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged by anyone he considered beneath his station. His face was flushed with the kind of anger that came from having his authority questioned by people he had spent years treating with contempt. "This is ridiculous," Dutch declared, his voice carrying across the street to the growing crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "That girl has no legal standing to make any kind of claims about mining rights or property ownership. She's just a squaw living in a tent." Carlos Mendoza's response was delivered with the calm precision of someone whose legal position was unassailable. "Mrs. Naliné Yazzie is the legal heir to substantial mining claims and property holdings that have been properly filed and maintained according to territorial and federal law. The documentation is comprehensive and the legal standing is absolute." The survey map, when unfolded for public examination, revealed the true scope of Tsela's achievements in a way that left the assembled crowd speechless. The official government document showed that the Yazzie claims covered not just scattered, small sites, but substantial portions of the most valuable mining territory in the entire Copper Creek district. Sheriff Morrison attempted to assert his authority by demanding to examine the legal documents personally, but his bluster quickly deflated when the federal marshals made it clear that territorial law enforcement had no jurisdiction over federal mining claims or the legal proceedings that were about to unfold. These claims, if legitimate, would make this woman one of the largest landowners in the territory, Morrison said, his voice betraying uncertainty as he examined the survey map's official notations. "How is it possible that no one knew about claims of this magnitude?" "The claims were filed and maintained according to proper legal procedures," Mendoza replied. "The fact that local authorities were unaware of them suggests inadequate attention to official territorial records rather than any deficiency in the filing process." Samuel Whitmore's arrival added the weight of financial expertise to the examination of Naliné's documentation. The banker's careful review of the legal papers revealed not just the scope of the mining claims, but evidence of the substantial financial transactions that had funded Tsela's legal strategy over a period of nearly 2 decades. The financial records show regular payments to legal firms, filing fees for multiple claims, and survey costs that represent tens of thousands of dollars in expenditures, Whitmore announced, his voice reflecting growing amazement at the sophistication of the financial planning involved. This was not the random activity of someone hoping to get lucky. This was a systematic business operation conducted with considerable resources and professional expertise. But it was Miguel Santos who provided the context that truly explained the magnitude of what was being revealed. Mrs. Tsela was not just filing claims for herself, he announced to the crowd. She was working with a network of Apache business leaders to establish legitimate mining enterprises that could provide economic security for Native American families throughout the territory. The revelation that Tsela had been part of a coordinated business network rather than an isolated individual changed the entire context of the legal proceedings. This was not simply about one woman's property rights. It was about a systematic effort by Apache leaders to establish legitimate economic enterprises within the framework of territorial law. Sarah McKenna stepped forward with additional documentation that further complicated the legal landscape facing Dutch Henley and his associates. Mrs. Yazzie also documented systematic fraud and corruption by territorial officials who have been illegally transferring Apache land to private ownership, she announced. This evidence has been provided to federal authorities who are conducting investigations into potential criminal violations. The survey map's most devastating revelation concerned the true ownership of several mining operations that had been the foundation of Dutch Henley's business empire. Claims that he had assumed were legally his were shown to overlap with or fall entirely within the boundaries of Tsela's properly filed mining claims. "This is impossible," Dutch protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I have legal documentation for all my mining claims. I purchased them legitimately from previous owners who had proper title. The previous owners did not have legal authority to sell what they did not legitimately own," Mendoza replied. "The federal survey confirms that Mrs. Yazzie's claims were filed prior to the competing claims and were properly maintained according to all legal requirements." As the morning progressed and the full scope of the legal documentation was revealed to the assembled crowd, the people of Copper Creek began to understand that their assumptions about power and ownership in their community had been fundamentally incorrect. The crazy Apache woman they had mocked for 20 years had been systematically building a legal empire that challenged the very foundations of their social and economic order. Tsela's final letter to Naliné emerged from its sealed envelope as the federal marshals placed Sheriff Morrison under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the federal government. His badge and weapon surrendering to the authority of law enforcement officers whose jurisdiction extended far beyond the corrupted boundaries of territorial politics. The letter itself, written in Tsela's careful hand just weeks before her death, provided the emotional resolution that transformed legal victory into something approaching spiritual reconciliation. "My beloved granddaughter," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, then the moment I have spent 20 years preparing for has finally arrived. You must understand that everything I endured, every insult I accepted, every moment of apparent humiliation, was a deliberate choice made in service of a larger purpose that I could never have achieved through open confrontation." Dutch Henley's business empire collapsed with stunning swiftness as federal investigators presented evidence of fraudulent land transfers, illegal mining operations, and systematic corruption that violated both territorial and federal law. The man who had spent years mocking Tsela's supposed poverty watched as his own substantial assets were frozen, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings that would determine whether his wealth had been accumulated through legitimate means. They said I wasted everything, Tsela's letter continued. But I was saving everything for you, for our people, for a future where Apache families could build legitimate prosperity without having to choose between their heritage and their survival. Every dollar I earned was invested in legal protection. Every slight I endured was an opportunity to gather evidence. Every day I appeared powerless was actually a day spent building real power that could not be taken away through violence or intimidation. The arrest of banker Samuel Whitmore on charges of financial fraud and conspiracy created a cascade of revelations about the systematic theft of Apache trust funds that had been occurring for more than a decade. His meticulously maintained records, which he had believed would protect him from prosecution, actually provided the documentation needed to trace millions of dollars in stolen assets back to their rightful owners. Carlos Mendoza's presentation of evidence to the assembled crowd revealed that the corruption extended far beyond Copper Creek to include territorial officials in Phoenix and Tucson who had been facilitating illegal land transfers throughout the Arizona Territory. The network of Apache business leaders that Tsela had been part of had documented similar fraud in dozens of communities, creating a pattern of systematic discrimination that would trigger federal reforms affecting the entire territorial administration. I know you must have wondered why I never fought back against their cruel words. Tsela's letter explained. The truth is that I was fighting back every single day, but I was fighting a war they didn't even know was being waged. While they saw a broken-down old woman who had nothing left to lose, I was building a legal fortress that would protect not just our family, but hundreds of Apache families throughout the territory. The townspeople of Copper Creek watched in stunned silence as Naliné read portions of her grandmother's final letter aloud, the words providing context that transformed their understanding of the woman they had spent 20 years dismissing as irrelevant to their community's affairs. The revelation that Tsela had been consciously allowing their contempt to serve as cover for sophisticated legal and business activities left many of them struggling to reconcile their memories with the reality being revealed. The tent where we lived was never meant to be permanent, the letter continued. It was a strategic position that allowed me to observe everything that mattered while appearing to threaten nothing that anyone valued. The humble shelter that they mocked was actually the headquarters for an operation that would eventually challenge the very foundations of their power. Federal investigators announced that the evidence compiled by Tsela and her network of Apache collaborators would result in the largest federal prosecution of territorial corruption in Arizona's history. The systematic nature of the fraud and discrimination documented in their records had prompted intervention by officials in Washington who were determined to ensure that territorial authorities could not continue operating outside the boundaries of federal law. Miguel Santos provided testimony that revealed the true scope of Tsela's influence in the territorial business community, describing meetings and correspondence that had connected her with some of the most successful legitimate mining operations in the region. Her advice and financial backing had contributed to the success of enterprises throughout the territory, though her involvement had been carefully concealed to protect both her own interests and the businesses she had supported. I want you to understand that you are inheriting more than money and property, Tsela's letter concluded. You are inheriting a responsibility to continue the work that I began, to use the legal victories we have won to protect other Apache families, and to demonstrate that our people can succeed in the white man's world without abandoning the values and traditions that make us who we are. Sarah McKenna's emotional testimony about her friendship with Tsela provided the human context that transformed the legal proceedings from abstract justice into personal vindication. Her description of conversations that revealed Tsela's genuine love for her granddaughter and her determination to create opportunities that had been denied to previous generations of Apache women brought tears to the eyes of observers who had never imagined the depth of planning and sacrifice that had guided the old woman's choices. As the afternoon sun reached its peak and the last of the legal formalities were completed, Naliné stood in the exact spot where her grandmother had endured 20 years of mockery and contempt. Now recognized as one of the territory's most substantial property owners and the heir to a legacy that extended far beyond financial wealth. The transformation was complete. The crazy Apache woman had been revealed as a master strategist whose patient planning had achieved victories that open confrontation could never have accomplished. 6 months after the revelation that transformed Copper Creek's understanding of power and justice, the foundation stones for Naliné's new house were carved with symbols that honored both her Apache heritage and the Christian faith that many of her neighbors practiced. The stones themselves were quarried from the same red rock formations where her grandmother had conducted her secret mining operations, and each one bore carvings that told the story of two cultures, learning to coexist with mutual respect rather than suspicion and fear. The house that rose from these foundations was impressive without being ostentatious, substantial enough to reflect Naliné's position as one of the territory's wealthiest women, while remaining rooted in the practical requirements of desert life. The architecture blended traditional Apache building techniques with modern conveniences, creating a structure that served as a bridge between past and future, just as Naliné herself had learned to navigate between different worlds. From her new home's front porch, Naliné could see the tent that had sheltered her grandmother's remarkable double life, now preserved as a memorial to Tsela's sacrifice and wisdom. The weathered canvas structure had been reinforced and protected from the elements, transforming it into a permanent reminder of how strength sometimes manifests as apparent vulnerability and how the most powerful resistance can take the form of patient endurance. The tent attracted visitors from throughout the territory, Apache families who came to pay respects to a woman who had fought for their rights, government officials who studied her methods as an example of successful legal strategy, and historians who recognized that her achievements represented a unique chapter in the story of Native American resistance and adaptation. A simple plaque beside the tent entrance bore the inscription, "In memory of Tsela, who understood that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the humblest places." The school that Naliné had established with a portion of her inheritance occupied the site where Dutch Henley's saloon had once stood. The corrupt businessman's former empire transformed into an institution that provided education for both Apache and Mexican children whose families had historically been excluded from formal learning opportunities. The curriculum included traditional Apache knowledge alongside reading, writing, and mathematics, ensuring that students could succeed in the modern world without losing connection to their cultural heritage. Miguel Santos had accepted Naliné's offer to serve as foreman of the expanded mining operation that now employed dozens of workers from various ethnic backgrounds, creating an economic enterprise that demonstrated how legitimate business could provide prosperity without exploitation or discrimination. The mining sites that Tsela had developed in secret were now operated as model enterprises that provided fair wages, safe working conditions, and profit-sharing arrangements that benefited the entire community. Sarah McKenna's position as the school's head teacher reflected both her friendship with Tsela and her commitment to the educational mission that had emerged from the legal victories of the previous year. Her experience in bridging different communities made her uniquely qualified to help students navigate the complex requirements of living successfully in a multicultural society while maintaining pride in their individual heritage. The legal precedents established through Tsela's carefully planned revelation had prompted federal reforms that affected territorial administration throughout the American West. New regulations required more rigorous oversight of mining claims and land transfers, while enhanced penalties for discrimination against Native American communities created deterrents that protected families who might otherwise have been vulnerable to the kind of systematic fraud that had been exposed in Copper Creek. But perhaps the most significant transformation was evident in the way that travelers now responded when they passed through Copper Creek and saw the memorial tent on the edge of town. Instead of mockery or dismissal, visitors approached with curiosity and respect, often stopping to read the historical marker that explained Tsela's remarkable achievements and the lessons they offered about the danger of judging people based on superficial appearances. The afternoon ritual that had once consisted of miners shouting cruel words as they passed Tsela's tent had been replaced by a different kind of daily observance. Children from the school would often gather at the memorial site in the evening, where Naliné would share stories about her grandmother's wisdom and the patience required to build something lasting in a world that often valued immediate gratification over long-term planning. Your great-grandmother understood something that took me years to learn, Naliné would tell these young listeners, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized Tsela's evening conversations. She knew that real power comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through actions that speak louder than words. She let people think she had nothing while she built everything. The financial empire that Tsela had constructed continued to grow under Naliné's management, but its expansion was guided by the same principles that had motivated her grandmother's patient accumulation of wealth and influence. Profits were reinvested in enterprises that provided opportunities for families throughout the territory, while legal protections were strengthened to ensure that the achievements of one generation could be preserved for the benefit of the next. On quiet evenings when the desert air carried the scent of sage and the promise of distant rain, Naliné would sit on her new porch and reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from grieving granddaughter to community leader. The transformation had taught her that inheritance consisted of more than money or property. It included the responsibility to honor the sacrifices of those who had come before while building foundations that could support the dreams of those who would come after. The red rock formations that surrounded Copper Creek continued to yield their treasures to careful prospectors, but the landscape itself had been transformed by the recognition that true wealth came from communities where different peoples could work together toward common goals rather than competing for dominance over one another. As stars emerged in the clear desert sky and the sounds of the town settled into the familiar rhythm of a community at peace with itself, Naliné could almost hear her grandmother's voice carried on the evening wind, speaking words of satisfaction and approval for the way that 20 years of patient planning had finally been transformed into lasting change. The tent that had sheltered their simple life together remained as a testament to the truth that had guided Tsela through all her years of apparent powerlessness. Sometimes the most important victories are won by those who understand that strength often wears the disguise of humility, and that the people who change the world are often those who allow others to underestimate them, while they quietly build something that can transform everything.